and welcome to everybody. Welcome to our New South Wales Small Business Month webinar series on HR Essentials for regionally based small business. My name is Bronwyn Pearson. Welcome to those who are joining us for the first time, and to those who have been loyal attendees over the COVID times, as well as since we've been doing these webinars for Small Business Month here in October. So for those who don't know me and haven't joined us before, my name is Bronwyn Pearson. I'm the CEO of Pinnacle People Solutions. I have over 25 years experience providing the full range of HR support, advice, solutions, strategies, etc. to regional employers of all sizes. And it's been a privilege to enhance regional communities by supporting local businesses across the wonderful state of New South Wales. So at 5:30 each Wednesday afternoon during the month of October, we have been refreshing ourselves on the HR basics with our small business colleagues. For the first 3 weeks, we looked at the sexy topics of contracts and position descriptions, record-keeping obligations, and paying your staff correctly. And today is the final instalment in that series, which is policies and procedures and making sure that you understand your lawful obligations. All of these videos will remain on our Facebook page, as well as up on our website. And on our website, you'll also find accompanying fact sheets for each of these webinar series. So you can come back and you can review them anytime, or you can refer colleagues or friends or family who you think might benefit from them to them also. Next Wednesday, we will be returning to our regular webinar broadcast, and we will have our wonderful consultant psychologist, Jessica Pearson, giving us hints and tips for assertive communication in the workplace. So I'm sure you're going to look forward to tuning in to Jess again next Wednesday. So I would encourage you to ask any questions that you might have as we go along. I will do my best to answer them. Of course, separately to that, you can always contact us at any time, at any stage, via Facebook, of course, private message, or you can use any of the contact means to get hold of us. There are many of them, and I'm sure my team are going to put those up in the chat screen in just a moment. So tonight we'll be looking at policies and procedures and what your lawful obligations are as a regionally based small business, or manager of a small business, or indeed you could well be here as a staff member of a regionally based small business out of curiosity, which is lovely. And if that's the case, we welcome you very much. So first and foremost, the big question that we get asked most often when it comes to talking about HR and work health and safety policies and procedures for organisations is, why do we have to have policies and procedures anyway? Look, what we do know is that so many organisations have weighty tomes of policy and procedures. It might be called the manual, yes, and that would be with capital letters, in your workplace, for example. It usually sits on the shelf, whether that's virtually or otherwise, getting dusty. No one really uses it. It never really gets updated. And it's just one of those things you have to meet your obligations, and is otherwise a waste of everyone's time, right? No, is the answer to that question. Just like having position descriptions and employment contracts protects your business by setting out exactly what your employees are expected to do and what their conditions and entitlements are and how you will treat them, having robust, usable, and easily updated policies and procedures protects your business by setting out exactly what your day-to-day expectations are of your staff, how they should behave in certain situations, and how everyone can be kept safe and healthy in the workplace. Policies and procedures very clearly define acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in the workplace. Unfortunately, common sense isn't quite so common, so the things that most of us might think would be expected standards of behaviour unfortunately need to be documented. So policies and procedures clearly define acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in the workplace. They also provide clear guidelines on how to undertake certain activities, and they make sure that there is uniformity and consistency in decision making and your operational procedures in your organisation. What we really want is a suite of policies and procedures that get straight to the point. They're not waffly, huge, tomes of things that nobody ever reads. They need to be clear, they need to be usable, they need to be dynamic, and ultimately they need to be responsive to the real world of your workplace. A term we often use for this, for policies and procedures, as much as we do contracts and position descriptions, is that yes, they must meet your lawful obligations as an employer. Beyond that, however, it is most important that they are fit for purpose, entirely fit for the nature and purpose of your business and what it is that you do. Okay, so one of the other questions that we very often get is what policies do I need to have to comply with my lawful obligations? Well, there is a considerable number that you must have in place in order to meet your lawful obligations. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the fact sheet that will go up with this video on our website will have all of this information for you. But it is important to have, if I just pick out some, and this is not an exclusive list, so just to be clear, but there are some that, for example, that you must have in place. You must have policies around leave that your staff are entitled to. You must have a code of conduct that establishes what the standards and expectations are that you have of staff and contractors and others who provide services to your business are required to comply with. You need to have a workplace bullying policy. Anti-harassment and anti-bullying policies are very important from both a health and safety perspective as well as from an employment law perspective. You need to have performance and misconduct policy in place. So something that is very clear about how you will go about handling any instances of unsatisfactory performance or conduct that is unsatisfactory. You need to have a whole range of health and safety policies and procedures in your organisation in order to meet your health and safety obligations under the work health and safety legislation as it would apply to you. And those obligations are particularly onerous. And while I understand that a lot of organisations feel that sometimes that is too onerous, I often remind them that the legislation and the regulations have each and every one of them have come about as a consequence of a fatality or a serious maim or injury. So there's a reason that those things are in place, and I don't know any small business owner that we work with who doesn't want, at the end of the day, for their staff to go home fully fit, all of their limbs intact, their mental health and well-being nice and strong, and all of the things that you should be doing to make sure that that's the case should be in your policy and procedure suite. So you should have a work health and safety policy and procedures, for example. You should have a risk management procedure, emergency evacuation, process and policy, electrical safety, first aid, working during hot weather if you've got staff who are working in extremes of weather. You want to have an incident report and investigation process, so if you do have any incidences or near misses in your organisation, that you've got a record of what they are and what you did to make sure that there was a limited chance of it happening again. Depending on the nature of your work, you might need to have a noise procedure. You might need to have a policy that stipulates what personal protective equipment that you would be making available to staff in certain circumstances. You would potentially have a working at heights procedure. If you have company vehicles and staff do drive them from time to time, you'll want to have a vehicle safety policy. You may well also, in accordance with other legislation, want to make sure you have a smoke-free policy for your workplace. You certainly will want a drug and alcohol policy and a workers' compensation and return to work process as well for your organisation. If you can hear that noise in the background, I'm not going to turn it off. I can't turn it off, and I'm not turning it off because it's wonderful rain. So we certainly can use that after the many, many months and years that we've had terrible drought situations. We'd smile every time that sound hits the roof. So We also would recommend a whole range of other policies as well as best practice. So whether that's a staff training and development policy, or whether it's social media, very important policy for any organisation to have in place. And of course, one of the policies that we immediately rolled out to all of our clients at the beginning of this year was an epidemic and pandemic policy. There are lots of other sorts of policies that may well be applicable to your workplace and your employees. Just as an example, if as an organisation you offer salary packaging, for example, you would have a salary packaging policy in place that sets out the expectations and the inclusions, along with any procedure on how to start a salary packaging arrangement, to amend it or terminate it. That's just as an example. Okay, so bearing in mind that you're probably thinking, if you don't have any policies and procedures in place currently, oh goodness, you're telling me all these things I have to do. How do we put these into practice then? The first thing to do is to consider what policies you already have in place and whether or not they're written down. And I say that because a lot of the way in which things are done around here in terms of an organisation, which I usually define as being the culture of the workplace, you will have informal, whether they're good or not, you'll have informal ways that people do things in your business, whether it's written down or not, and whether it's compliant with your employment obligations and your work health and safety obligations or not, that's also another story. But how does your business do things? Is the way that your business does things the best or the legal way to do it? What could be done better? Policies and procedures should be written down for clarity and for ease of explaining to anybody, whether they're a contractor, if it covers them too, or whether it's a new staff member that you might have coming into the business. You want everybody to be able to follow your policy and procedures consistently, both now and into the future. If you're not sure where to start, there are many places that you can buy template policies online to tweak to your business needs, or otherwise you can get professional advice and have a suite prepared for you that's entirely fit for purpose for your business. The thing to remember though in terms of policy and procedure in your organisation is that no one can put anything into practice if they don't know about it. So educating yourself and making sure that you educate your staff on what is contained within your policies and procedures manual, how it works and what needs to be done is the next step. So it's good practice, although it isn't legally required, to have all employees and any new ones into the future sign off that they've read and understood the company's policies and procedures and agree to abide by them. That's actually been an important component when some organisations have found themselves in legal jurisdictions, that they in fact had those processes and staff signing off on that they understood and would comply with them in place. It's important to hold regular training sessions for your staff. Now, this doesn't have to be a war and peace and take hours and hours. It might be as simple as picking a procedure to look at in detail during a toolbox or a stand-up meeting once a week. And we have a number of clients where we log into their toolbox meetings a couple of times a week for about 5 or 10 minutes and go over a policy or a procedure just to keep everybody nice and familiar with what the organisation is doing. Make sure that your policies and procedures are accessible, either in hard copy or in soft copy. So if you've got them up on an internal server or a record storage of some description, make sure that everybody has access to them, and make sure that as you're updating them as time goes on, that everybody's notified about that so they can get the most recent copies. So once you have everyone in your workplace aware of and understanding your company's policies and procedures, the key is to lead by example to implement them. So if a staff member asks you a particularly interesting question about taking leave or maybe cashing out annual leave, as an example, you'd want to pull that document off the proverbial shelf and have a look at what your leave policy says, and then follow that policy. Your guys are starting a new job that involves ladders. Pull that manual off the shelf and have a quick review of the safe working at heights procedure to ensure that everyone is kept as safe as possible in the work environment. You have a new contractor starting. Pull out your contractor management checklist to make sure that you dot all the I's and cross all the T's, and that contractor understands what's expected when they're working for you and on your site. If through that kind of process, this kind of process, you find that something doesn't work for you, or it did work for you before but it doesn't anymore, for either you or your workplace, change it. Obviously, consult with your employees, get professional advice to ensure you're still meeting your lawful obligations and not giving bad instructions, particularly regarding safety, but then you can update the document. Policies and procedures are not wholly scripts that handed down from on high to be followed despite your better judgment. Remember that they're living documents that are designed to help your workplace function at its best. So if they're not fit for purpose, they're not going to be particularly helpful. So the next question that we often get asked is, what happens if I do the wrong thing? There's really two main ways that things can go really pear-shaped for businesses in respect of that question. The first is that your business doesn't have a policy in place and something goes wrong. So without policy and procedure in place, it's really difficult to manage staff and also manage expectations about how things will operate in your workplace. Decisions can be made inconsistently, and you might find yourself either giving constant instruction to someone on how to do something or putting extra effort into reinventing the wheel every time a situation or a similar situation arises. Or you could find yourself in a situation where you followed what you thought was an appropriate way of doing something in order to deal with a staffing issue and find that the way that you handled it was not appropriate. And an example I want to give you about that is a case that went through the Fair Work Ombudsman and right through to the federal court about 12 months ago. This was the case of a staff member. They were a sales representative with a company. They'd been with the company about 14 years. And the company had come to the company's attention via an anonymous tip-off that the sales representative had been downloading and watching porn on his work laptop. So the company did a number of things. They seized the laptop. They told the staff member that they had to look at the laptop. They sent it to their outsourced IT provider to review the laptop. The IT provider advised that the laptop had indeed had porn downloaded onto it. So the staff member was questioned by a member of the senior team and asked about it, and he said, oh yes, that his computer had a virus a few weeks earlier, and that must have been the reason for there being a downloading of something that he didn't actively do. So they sent it back out to the IT crew again. They said, no, there's been no virus on this machine, and they ran diagnostics and such, and so the only plausible explanation was that this staff member had actually downloaded the porn and so forth. So they gave the staff member, as they felt they should, an opportunity to provide his version of events and his response to the allegations, which he did. The company decided at the end of the day that that was not appropriate behaviour for their company and it wasn't something that they would tolerate, and so they terminated his employment. He then lodged an unfair dismissal claim with the Fair Work Ombudsman. And the upshot of that was that he won his case and he was paid out $26,000. The reason he won his case is because at no stage along the process did the company have appropriate policy in place. So for example, the first thing that they did was they seized his laptop and sought to interrogate the records that were on that laptop. In every state of Australia, there is what's called a Workplace Surveillance Act. This is separate to any employment legislation, but what that act does is make it really clear what employers can and can't do when it comes to interrogating their own material. So when you back up your server, when you back up email and internet traffic, accounts payable and receivable, payroll, all of those things which a business would routinely in most cases do in order to manage its risk. You can't go back and look at those documents or those records as the employer or as the organisation without having given your staff notice under the relevant state act for workplace surveillance that you may have cause to do that at some point. Now, we would always recommend that that notice is provided up front in an employment contract. But in addition, you'd want to have a workplace surveillance policy that makes it really clear that you're complying with the provisions of that legislation. They hadn't done either of those things, and they didn't give this staff member notice that they were going to do that. And under the legislation, having not had a policy or not having given him notice before, they would have had to have given him 2 weeks' notice of their intent to do that. So they didn't do that. That was the first thing. The second thing is they had no policy and procedure in place on the use of company equipment, so the use of employer property, or indeed the use of internet, email and communication facilities in the organisation. So no parameters again for how a staff member will treat or use company property, or indeed use facilities that the company provides in the course of them doing their work. Had they had either of those things, that would have helped to establish what he can and can't do with the laptop. They also didn't have a performance or misconduct policy, which would have set out, ideally, the due process to go through in the event that an issue of conduct or performance is raised. They did do the right things in terms of providing him an opportunity to reply to the allegations, etc. But at the end of the day, the Commission also found that the termination was harsh, unjust and unreasonable on the staff member because it wasn't a matter of serious misconduct, it wasn't gross misconduct as the case law has defined, and so he hadn't had any records on file for being counselled for any other similar issues before, and so the determination was that the company had not followed appropriate process, had not met their legislative obligations, and indeed the decision to terminate his employment was harsh and unjust and unreasonable in the circumstances. So while most people in hearing the short facts on that case will go, well, if you're going to use your workplace computer to download and watch porn during work hours, there's a reasonable chance the employer is not going to be happy and potentially you could lose your job. In this instance, the person was found to have been unfairly dismissed. So that's a case where there weren't appropriate policies and procedures in place, and it tripped the company up on a whole range of different angles, leading to the award to this staff member. The other area where things can go pear-shaped for business is where there's a discrepancy between what your policies and procedures for the company say and what you actually do. So you might have noticed in the media, particularly in the last few months, that there's a number of very large organisations that have been in very public trouble regarding sexual harassment in the workplace. And it's actually taken the seats of a number of quite significant chairpeople and directors of boards, as well as senior staff, CEOs and the like, for large organisations. And interestingly, in those cases, the issue has not been so much what exactly was done to address the problem. It would appear that procedurally things were done appropriately according to the company's policy, but the problem essentially was that the established policies and procedures weren't followed, even at the highest level of governance. And this was in particular in relationship to the anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policies that the company had in place. They were clearly flagrantly disregarding their own company policies in terms of what was deemed to be acceptable in the workplace and what was not, according to the policy. So that is another way which can really create havoc for any business owner or manager, but in particular small businesses, because unfortunately, when you have a situation that might end up going through the Fair Work Ombudsman or indeed the federal court ultimately, I've seen those sorts of situations, or indeed ones that relate to health and safety, can absolutely cripple and in some cases bankrupt a business. And you don't want that to be you. So the next obvious question is, what do I do now? As a small business owner or manager, what do I do? Well, my first question for you would be, when is the last time you looked at your workplace manual, your handbook, the manual, whatever you call it, or indeed you may not even have one at all? Pick a policy at random and make sure that it's being followed. So if you do have things in place, do a little self-audit and see how it's going. The second question I would get you to ask yourself is, do you know what your lawful obligations are as a person carrying out a business or undertaking, which is the definition of what a business is under the work health and safety legislation? What does the law require you to have policies and procedures in place for? And do you know that? If you don't fear, don't freak out. We can absolutely help you with any and all of this. If you don't have anything like what I've talked about tonight in place at all, or you're worried that what you've got is 10 or 15 years old, or you don't know how old it is, and certainly you're assuming it's not being implemented, or indeed it may not be even lawful anymore, it's a good idea as soon as possible to make sure that you get an understanding of what you need to have in place and get it in place. That is fundamentally important, not the least of which to reduce the risk for your business. If you're not sure what to do at any particular point in time, you can always seek professional advice. So please don't hesitate to do that. We'd be very happy to sit with you. No obligation, free initial consultation with us. You may well walk away from that, as a lot of our potential clients do, with answers to what they needed to know, and they don't need to engage us any further beyond that initial consultation. So it can't hurt you to have that initial conversation and potentially point you in the right direction so that you can breathe a little easier. I haven't had any questions come up in the chat screen at this point in time, but of course you can always feel free to use all of those communication channels that we've shared with you this evening to get in touch with us and ask us anything that relates to you and your business. Thank you so much for joining us again this evening. And for those joining us for the first time, welcome. It's delightful to have you with us this evening. And thank you to all of you who have joined in on one or more of our Small Business Month webinars here in October. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure to share this information with you and to talk to our small business colleagues about these really important aspects of running your business. If you have any specific questions, as I said, about your business, or you'd like us to help you out, you can contact us anytime via email, Facebook, phone. All of the connections and contacts are in our chat screen this evening. You can also catch up on any and all of this month's webinars that we've run for Small Business Month up on our website. They're also on our YouTube and Facebook accounts. And we also have associated fact sheets for each of them, which you can get from our website. So don't forget, as I mentioned at the outset of this evening's seminar, that next Wednesday we will be returning to our regular webinar broadcast. So we still do webinars every Wednesday evening at 5:30 on hot HR topics, and also topics to assist with workplace health and wellbeing. And next week you have the wonderful Jessica Pearson, our consultant psychologist, who will be delivering a fantastic session giving us hints and tips for assertive communication in the workplace. So thank you so much again for joining us this evening. It's been delightful to have you, and we look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday at 5:30.